I'm going to talk about the role of women human rights defenders in building civil and just society. And all our work is concentrated on human rights defenders, those people who risk their lives for the rights of others. In Frontline Defenders, human rights defenders are our inspiration because day in, day out, they face with unquenchable spirit and courage, uncertainty, risk, and horror. One of those who became a friend was Betty Carino, and she was killed in Mexico in 2010 by violent paramilitaries as she and a group of other 30 human rights defenders tried to deliver humanitarian aid to an indigenous community who were under attack by armed groups. She said, "Today we want to live another history. We are rebelling. We are saying enough is enough. Today and here we want to say that they are afraid of us because we are not afraid of them. Because despite their threats, despite their slander, despite their harassment, we continue to walk towards the sun, which we know shines brightly." Frontline Defenders works for the human rights defenders at risk because of their non-violent work on behalf of others. Our aim is to try and protect them from persecution and increase their political space to be able to carry out their legitimate work. A human rights defender is somebody who upholds any or all of the articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at great personal risk. Strange as it may seem, repression is often a measure of effectiveness. Human rights defenders face harassment, surveillance, death threats, detention, torture, defamation in the press, suspension from their employment, denial of freedom of expression and association and movement, difficulty in obtaining legal registration for their organizations, trumped-up law charges, and legislation prohibiting foreign funding. Often their families are targeted, and in some countries they are killed and disappeared. In terms of the international framework, the UN adopted in 1998 the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, and the mandate of the Special Representative on the Situation of Human Rights Defenders was established in 2000. The mandate calls on the Special Rapporteur, as he is known, to seek, receive, and examine and act on the situation of human rights defenders, to enter into dialogue with governments and other interested actors, and to make recommendations to improve the protection of defenders. So the Special Rapporteur then generally takes actions which include conducting country visits for research, taking up individual cases with governments, and reporting each year to both the Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly. And in 2004, under the Irish presidency, the EU adopted guidelines for the protection of human rights defenders. And these spell out the steps that member states of the EU are supposed to take to protect human rights defenders. And also the EU Commission and the External Action Service and all bits of the EU. And they are supposed to do things like raise individual cases with the authorities when they're making country visits, and raise them in political dialogues, raise cases in political dialogues, and through the Universal Periodic Review, which is a sort of a review mechanism at the UN where all countries' human rights records are reviewed. And they are supposed to maintain suitable contacts with human rights defenders, invite them to their embassies or go and visit them in their place of work, because this gives credibility and a legitimacy and a recognition that they are doing legitimate work. And so this feeds into giving visible recognition to human rights defenders. And also they're supposed to attend trials where possible. So today I'm going to concentrate on women human rights defenders who work at great personal risk to defend the rights of others, as well as a range of other activists of all sexualities who also defend the rights of women. They are targeted not only for what they do, but for who they are. They face the same threats as their male colleagues from governments and non-state actors, but also additional threats because of their gender. Some women human rights defenders are active as part of an NGO, a non-governmental organisation, while some fight virtually alone, unsupported and even abused by their family or their community because of their human rights work. As they fight for human rights, they also challenge stereotypes, cultural norms and traditions about the role of women in society, and they are even more exposed to labelling and stigmatisation than their male colleagues. They're called names such as prostitutes, bad wives, bad mothers, witches. Monica Paulus is a woman human rights defender who we've just assisted in Papua New Guinea. She works against sorcery, and she faces serious risks due to her work, in particular at the moment about the stoning of a 20-year-old man to death by the police. And as a result of her work, she's had to move to a safe place. Her daughter was shot in the eye with a rubber bullet. And in November, drunken policemen came to her village and were looking for her because she was a criminal, because she's taking a case against them. And they destroyed 15 homes, and including Monica's, as well as all the livestock. Before they left, the police claimed they were assaulted and demanded a bribe, I suppose, of 1,500 kina and 2 pigs. In her report to the United Nations General Assembly, Margaret Sakaja, the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders, said, "Women defenders are more at risk of suffering certain forms of violence, in particular when they work in the area of women's rights. They can be particularly acute when women defenders are perceived as challenging cultural norms and social constructs related to gender, femininity, and sexuality. Women who defend human rights are much more likely than men to face sexual violence, restrictions on their ability to leave the home or travel, conviction on moral crimes, threats and violence against their children, slurs on their role as mothers and wives, gender-based attacks on their reputation, and social isolation. LGBTI defenders, lesbian, gay, transsexual, bisexual, intersex defenders can face additional discrimination, violence and abuse by police, colleagues and family members, and even other human rights groups who accept only heterosexuality and the representation of the male or female gender only. Last Wednesday, we launched our annual report. I'd like to give you an overview of the trends for 2014. Of course, these trends apply to both men and women and other human rights defenders of different sexual and gender orientation, but I'll pick out some examples of women or LGBTI cases to illustrate this. We estimate that over 130 human rights defenders were killed or died in detention in the first 10 months of November, of 2014, up to November. While most notable in the Americas, in fact, 41 human rights defenders were actually killed in Colombia alone. Extreme violence affected human rights defenders in all world regions. So you had killings, I think you can take it off now. You had killings in Brazil, Burma, China, Colombia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, India, Indonesia, Iraq, Libya, Mexico, Nigeria, Pakistan, Peru, the Philippines, Somalia, Syria, Turkey, and Uzbekistan. And I deliberately read them out just to give you the extent of the scale of killings around the world, of people who are killed just because they're doing human rights work non-violently. For example, last September, a lawyer in Iraq, Samira Salah al-Nami, who had advocated for the rights of detainees in disadvantaged populations, was abducted, and she was killed by ISIS. And in May last year, Sanda Luz Hernandez, who is a member of the Mothers of the Disappeared Children in Mexico, which is an organization that seeks to combat impunity for their disappeared children, she was shot 15 times in the head and in broad daylight and was killed. Globally, deprivation of liberty and the use of court proceedings remain the two most widely used strategies to silence human rights defenders. This was particularly true in Asia, Eurasia, and the Middle East and North Africa, and they accounted for over 2/3 of the cases that we documented in those regions. Threats of physical harm completed the list of the top 3 tactics used against human rights defenders globally. We also recorded an increase in the number of raids, of break-ins, of travel bans of human rights defenders called in for questioning. And for example, in December in Egypt, which is going rapidly downhill, Yara Salam was sentenced to, she's an Egyptian woman human rights defender, she was sentenced to 2 years in prison and charged with breaching Egypt's controversial protest law. There were also a number of crackdowns during the year, in particular Azerbaijan, Cambodia, Egypt, Russian Federation, Sudan, Thailand, and Ukraine. Sometimes as part of a wider political crisis like Ukraine and Thailand, but in other cases was specifically targeted at human rights defenders. The case of Azerbaijan is emblematic, partly because of its position as a strategic partner of the EU, but also because at the time of the crackdown, it was holding the chairmanship of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe. Human rights defenders and journalists were arrested on charges of treason, espionage, or economic crimes, and they were subjected to travel bans. And attacks had their bank accounts frozen, and many were forced to flee the country. Leyla Yunus, who is a long-time human rights defender from Azerbaijan, she's been working for at least 20 years there. She's the director of the Institute for Peace and Democracy. She's been in pre-trial detention since 2014, waiting to answer charges of treason and economic crimes. She's been denied access to her lawyer. She's been beaten up by prison guards and her cellmate, and her physical health has deteriorated significantly during her time in detention. Repressive laws continue to spread around the world. It's a bit like cut and paste repression. At the moment, we have legislation restricting funding, either adopted or pending, in 8 countries. And this is a way to neutralize the work of human rights defenders and their organizations by not allowing them to get funding from outside, which is part of what's in the Declaration of Human Rights Defenders. You're allowed access to funding. Ethiopia was the first country who brought it in, and in a country that is not very financially sort of, I suppose, advanced. It's hard to get money for human rights work, and particularly where a government is not open. So it immediately meant that most of the human rights organizations in Ethiopia weren't able to function. And there's also 9 countries who are considering or have passed legislation on issues such as freedom of assembly, terrorism, the internet, trade unions, police powers, or LGBTI activism. And we have seen in the past how these kind of laws are used against human rights defenders. Targeted digital attacks against human rights defenders were also on the rise and occurred with varying degrees of sophistication virtually everywhere. It included interception of emails, voice, or other types of communication, hacking of websites, blogs, email, or social network accounts, the installation of malware or spyware, and the banning of websites. And one of our previous award winners, a wonderful young woman called Razan Ghazawi from Syria, who operated right through the crisis, was imprisoned, well, still going on, but she was imprisoned because she was a blogger. And she blogged under her own name, which was obviously hugely dangerous. And because of her documenting of the violations that were happening, she was imprisoned. She's out now, though, thank God. Sometimes less sophisticated tactics were used and were equally effective. In Vietnam, where the state-controlled media environment made Facebook an essential tool for debate and access to information, the profiles of human rights defenders and human rights groups were the subject of a number of complaints by pro-government officials, and that led to their suspension by Facebook. Vulnerability to physical attacks was highest in areas torn apart by conflict. Women human rights defenders in Eastern Congo were particularly exposed to physical and sexual violence, and they were the recipients of over half of the emergency grants that we gave last year. In September, we gave a grant for medical treatment to 2 members of this organisation called Action for Women Against Torture, an organisation defending the rights of women based in the village of Mwaba Kangando. And they were kidnapped, they were beaten up very badly, and they were held for 2 days after spending a day documenting numerous cases of torture and sexual violence committed by armed groups. Eastern Congo, in my view, is one of the saddest places in the world. Rebecca Misaku, who is a woman who displays exceptional courage in Eastern Congo, she's an extraordinary woman. She, like many women there, she was raped during one of the many incursions and outbursts of fighting, but to say that she was raped is almost to minimize the incredible and gratuitous violence that she's had to suffer. Her husband was cut to pieces in front of her daughters were raped, and she was rejected by her husband's family. But Rebecca summoned up the courage and the strength to act, not just for herself, but for the other women in her community in the same situation. She set up a group called the Association of Disinherited Persons United for Development. They live in a compound which we've made secure, and they support each other, working in the fields and growing food to sell so that they can rebuild their lives and the children can go to school. Despite being raped, and it happened again once when she was out on the road, she was recognized by the militia. She said, "I had to do something empowering for myself and for the women, to help women move from the state they are in today and reconnect to the women that they were before. We want to show them that just because you have been raped, this is not the end. You can start again and build something fresh and new. You can be something." Picking out a few other trends for individual regions, I can say that the use of fabricated charges against environmental and land rights defenders in Latin America was particularly noticeable. Alongside state institutions, human rights defenders were targeted significantly by non-state actors, including paramilitary groups, criminal groups, private security companies, and assassins or thugs acting on behalf of national and transnational businesses. In 2012, I met this woman called Yolanda Okili in Guatemala. We had just moved her to a safe house after she was shot because she had been protesting against a mine in San Jose del Golfo, which was just put in without any kind of discussion with the people that it was, the community that it was going to affect. Since the attempted assassination, she's had a bullet just here next to her spine, and she's always in pain. and her family and herself have been subjected to further intimidation and judicial harassment since then. And speaking to us in Dublin, she said, "In our country, the law is not respected, but instead used to target human rights defenders. The law is like a snake, only biting barefoot people, and we walk with the barefoot people." Noticeable in Asia were reprisals for accessing international human rights mechanisms. In China, Cao Xunli, a very brave woman who was trying to, she was encouraging civil society to participate in the mechanisms of the United Nations, and in particular China's examination at the UN. So she was going to a training and then to the UN Human Rights Council. She was detained before she got on the plane. She was put in prison, and she died in prison from no medical attention in March last year. There was a marked increase in harassment and attacks on defenders of LGBTI rights in Europe and Central Asia. There was also an increase in threats and in the number of human rights defenders being called in for questioning. Economic charges, tax evasion, embezzlement, or financial irregularities are often used to get at human rights defenders, because a lot of governments, they just like to tie human rights defenders up in repeated judicial charges to neutralise them so that they can't be doing their work. They just have to fight all these charges. There was somebody in Peru, for example, who had 40 charges against them, but they won them all. But I mean, they weren't able to do any human rights work while they were doing this. In the Russian Federation, by the end of the year, 16 human rights organisations were listed under this new foreign agents law. And this is a very dangerous development in Russia, because it has a sort of a resonance with old times, foreign agents. And since it's come into force, a lot of NGOs have had to just close up because they haven't the time or the resources needed to oppose inspections, warnings, and court proceedings. And one organisation that has been listed under this law is the Union of Women of Dawn, it's called, a human rights organisation that aims at promoting gender equality, works on peace building and human rights education, and provides citizens with legal consultations. Women and lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender defenders are particularly at risk, doubly discriminated against because of who they are, as well as I said, as what they do. And these people get up in the morning, and oftentimes they don't know if they're going to be coming home that night. In every country in the world, there are people like these who work to get clean water for their village, or work to protect their environment against illegal exploitation, or challenge discrimination against women and minorities, or the abuse of power by governments. And that's why we focus all our activities on human rights defenders who work non-violently against all the odds for the rights of others. We see them as agents of social change who build civil and just societies in their countries. The first thing we do is credible research. We find out who they are, where they are, what risks they face, economic as well as social, cultural, civil and political. We carried out 37 missions to 28 countries last year. We do a lot of lobbying and advocacy through the UN and the EU, but also the African Commission, the Inter-American Commission, and individual governments. So last year we had 265 appeals on behalf of 442 people in 64 countries, just to give you an idea. For example, in Zimbabwe, WOZA, which is Women of Zimbabwe Arise, they were arrested, and we got a text saying, WOZA 49 in custody for handing in a petition. Now 43 to one cell. We rang the police station in Bulawayo immediately. That was really funny. They kept saying, "Who? Who are you? What?" It was just so funny to see to get the reaction of the police there. They just couldn't believe that somebody who was in another country would know the next day that women had been arrested and had been put in prison. So simultaneously, the Irish Embassy got in touch with the Dutch Embassy on the ground in Bulawayo, and the women were released the next day. We also do training in personal security and risk assessment, and in other words, how you manage the risks you face, how you increase your capacity and decrease your ability to attack. And 196 human rights defenders were trained last year in this, and the same with digital security, how you pass and store information safely, and we had 372 defenders trained in that. We have a security grants program where we give money out to human rights defenders to improve their security. And last year we gave grants totaling €987,000 to individuals and organisations at risk. And these can be things like walls around offices, like in the case of Rebecca, we reinforced her compound for the women and the children born of rape. Bulletproof vests, laptops, mobiles, so that they can keep in touch with their colleagues when they're in the field. Medical treatment and psychosocial assistance after attack or torture. And of course, lawyers for trials. Those kind of practical stuff. The National Centre Against Violence in Mongolia works against domestic violence and sexual abuse, and both the staff and the service users face stalking, threats and abuse from perpetrators. So we funded a security camera so that the staff and the visitors could feel more secure, and it also allowed them to document any abusive behaviour, which could then be used subsequently. And every 2 years we organise the Dublin Platform for Human Rights Defenders. We bring over 100 human rights defenders from 90 countries, and they share experiences, learn from each other, and interact with intergovernmental and international organisations. But it's also a chance for them to have a break from the relentless pressure under which they live. And each year we give an award to a human rights defender who has shown exceptional courage. And last year we gave the award to a woman called Noorzia from northwest Pakistan. And her sister had been murdered on her way to work. They are working for the rights for both. They're working for both education of women and financial empowerment of women. And her sister was killed on the way to work, and the office was bombed. And just over Christmas, we had to move a colleague because, we've had to move them all at the moment because a colleague of Noorzia's, his father was abducted because of their work. So we do rolling internships as well in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and at the African Commission. And in emergency situations like the one with Monica Paulus, the woman who works against sorcery in PNG, we moved her when all this started to happen in November, and we actually just gave her another grant to keep her out, and also medical assistance for her daughter who was shot in the eye. So they're in a safe house at the moment, and there were another 124 people last year who had to be moved because of extreme danger. And we have a temporary rest and respite scheme. And just the other day, Mary Akrami, who's a woman human rights defender from Afghanistan, and I went to Afghanistan last year, and it is really a very insecure environment for women human rights defenders and women. So we were delighted to be able to bring her to Dublin for 2 months rest and respite. She's gone to the West, where she'll experience the elements. So we work in 5 languages: English, French, Spanish, Arabic and Russian, and 24-hour round-the-clock assistance is available. But we believe that the oppressors will ultimately lose. They have to keep winning every day, and human rights defenders only have to win now and again to keep hope alive, and hope is always stronger than fear. One of my favourite stories about hope is that of Mutabar Tajibayeva from Uzbekistan. Mutabar I love the name of this. She runs this organisation called Fiery Hearts. It really describes her to a T. And she was put in prison for 8 years she was coming to Dublin at the time, and she was held often in solitary confinement, and they had a noose in her cell in the hope that she'd commit suicide. And we obviously did what we could, but when all our efforts were failing, we decided to try and send her flowers for her birthday. And we weren't sure if they'd arrive. We didn't know whether the prison would accept them. But we wanted her to know she wasn't forgotten. And miraculously, she got the flowers. And she sent us this message through her family. I think that of every birthday in all my life I will remember is this birthday in prison, when you sent me the flowers. I think that not only me, but other women prisoners who were present in this magic moment will remember it. You cannot imagine the miracle you made on this day. You showed the society the weakness of the dictatorship. It was the most beautiful, the most precious gift I have ever received. This moment was the first symbol of our victory. And thankfully she was released after 2 years and 8 months. In every country, there are brave people who live up to that standard, who refuse to be silenced, and who resist injustice, and who seek to uphold the rights of their fellow people. Human rights defenders are golden people who shed light on the darkest corners of the world. Their invincible spirit helps us all to stand up and be counted. And nowhere is this spirit, and they all have it. It's just mind-boggling. More evident than in the words of Anna Politkovskaya, the journalist and the human rights defender who was murdered in Russia in the lift of her apartment because she used to go back and forth to Chechnya documenting abuses. And she said, "So each time I go there, people tell me things. They do so in the sincere hope that if I record what is actually happening, it will lead to change, to peace." Obviously, I am not to blame for what is going on, but the more I think about it, the more I would be betraying these people if I walked away. The only thing to do is to take this to the bitter end so that no one can say that when things became difficult, I walked away. Thank you.